August 17, 1943. RAF Waddington, Lincolnshire. 04:23 hours. Pilot Officer Henry Blackwood stumbled out of the debriefing room, hands still shaking, uniform soaked with sweat despite the cool pre-dawn air. 23 years old. 7 operational missions completed. And 3 hours ago over Hamburg he had done everything wrong. He'd panicked. When the night fighter appeared, a Bf-110 materializing from darkness like a predator from deep water, he hadn't followed doctrine, hadn't maintained formation discipline, hadn't executed the prescribed defensive procedures that 2 months of training had drilled into his reflexes. He'd simply reacted, slammed the Lancaster into a dive that felt like falling, yanked back on the controls in a climbing turn that pushed his crew into their seats, rolled the aircraft through maneuvers that no bomber was supposed to attempt, movements born not from training, but from pure survival instinct, while his gunners screamed coordinates and his flight engineer shouted warnings about stress limits and structural integrity. The fighter had broken off. The Lancaster had survived. All 7 crew members had made it home. But Blackwood knew the truth. He'd lost control. He'd failed as a pilot. He'd endangered his crew through incompetence disguised as heroism. Except the squadron's senior intelligence officer, Wing Commander Sarah Thornton, was walking toward him with an expression that wasn't anger. It was curiosity, and curiosity, in military intelligence, was often more dangerous than rage. RAF Bomber Command in August 1943 operated according to tactical doctrines refined through 3 years of brutal attrition. Formation flying maximized defensive firepower. Level flight during bomb runs ensured accuracy. Prescribed evasive maneuvers, gentle banks, coordinated turns, allowed crews to maintain mutual support while complicating enemy firing solutions. These weren't suggestions. They were doctrine, codified in training manuals, enforced through command hierarchy, proven through thousands of sorties. Deviation from doctrine was considered dangerous not because the rules were arbitrary, but because they represented accumulated wisdom purchased with blood. Young pilots learned quickly: follow procedures, trust your training, maintain discipline. The crews who survived weren't the ones who tried something creative. They were the ones who did exactly what they'd been taught, exactly when they'd been taught to do it. Blackwood had violated every principle. Wing Commander Thornton pulled him into a private office, spread out his crew's combat reports, and asked a question that made his stomach tighten. "Talk me through exactly what you did." He expected court-martial. He got interrogation. The fighter came from below and behind, standard approach vector. "I should have executed a coordinated turn while maintaining altitude, giving my gunners optimal firing angles while preserving formation integrity. But you didn't." "No, ma'am. I dove. Hard dive, maybe 45 degrees, full throttle, then pulled up into a climbing turn, rolled to port, leveled out, then dove again. It wasn't coordinated. It wasn't controlled. It was panic." Thornton reviewed the combat reports, statements from his gunners, his navigator, his flight engineer, all of them describing the same chaotic sequence of movements, the same desperate maneuvers that shouldn't have worked but somehow had. "Your dorsal gunner reports the fighter broke off after your second dive. Your rear gunner says the Messerschmitt tried to track you through the climbing turn, but couldn't maintain firing solution. Your flight engineer confirms you pushed the aircraft to 97% of maximum stress limits, but never exceeded them." "Ma'am, I wasn't calculating stress limits, I was just trying not to die." "I know, that's what interests me." She pulled out a different document: gun camera footage analysis, loss reports, tactical assessments. "Pilot Officer Blackwood, you're not the first person to panic under fire. You are, however, possibly the first person whose panic exactly matched the flight characteristics necessary to break a night fighter's targeting solution." Blackwood stared at her. "Ma'am, you accidentally discovered something. Now I need to understand if it's replicable." The problem with panic was that it defied systematic analysis. Squadron leader James Hartwell, senior flight instructor and veteran of 89 combat missions, listened to Thornton's proposal with increasing incredulity. "You want to train pilots to panic. I want to train pilots to execute the maneuvers Blackwood performed instinctively. Rapid altitude changes, aggressive turns, unpredictable flight paths. Those aren't tactics, that's loss of control." "Is it?" Blackwood's flight engineer confirms he never exceeded structural limits. His navigator confirms he maintained general heading toward the target. His gunners confirm the maneuvers gave them unexpected firing opportunities. And the German fighter broke off. Hartwell pulled out training manuals, doctrine specifications, safety protocols. We train pilots in coordinated evasive maneuvers because they're safe, predictable, and allow formation integrity. What you're describing is violent maneuvering that would scatter a formation, disorient crews, and quite possibly result in mid-air collisions or structural failure. What I'm describing is a rookie pilot who survived an engagement that statistically should have killed him. One data point. One panicked pilot who got lucky. Thornton leaned forward. James, how many aircraft did we lose last month? The silence was heavy. They both knew the number. 178 aircraft, fighting 246 men. We lose experienced crews following doctrine perfectly, Thornton continued quietly. We lose them because German fighters have spent 3 years learning how we respond to attacks. They know our evasive procedures. They calculate interception angles based on our prescribed maneuvers. We're predictable, and predictability is fatal. So your solution is unpredictability through panic? My solution is controlled unpredictability. Maneuvers aggressive enough to break enemy targeting solutions, but disciplined enough to remain within aircraft structural limits. Hartwell walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where ground crews prepared bombers for that night's mission. Young men climbing into aircraft that might not return. You're asking me to fundamentally change how we train pilots, to teach them to deliberately push aircraft to the edge of controllability. I'm asking you to consider whether doctrine written in 1940 remains optimal in 1943, after the enemy has had 3 years to adapt to it. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. Bring me Blackwood. If he can explain what he did well enough to teach it, I'll consider testing it. But I need more than panic. I need replicable technique. Agreed. And Thornton, if this goes wrong, if we lose aircraft because pilots lose control attempting what they think are panic maneuvers, this stops immediately. Understood. What neither of them said. Doing nothing had a guaranteed cost. Innovation at least offered possibility. August 20th, 1943. RAF Waddington. Flight Training Section. Henry Blackwood stood in a briefing room facing 5 senior pilots, all of whom had more combat experience than he'd ever accumulate, and attempted to explain how he'd panicked his way to survival. I didn't follow a procedure, he began, voice uncertain. I just reacted. The fighter was closing. My gunner was shouting coordinates, and I knew if I did the standard evasive turn, the Messerschmitt would compensate. They've seen that maneuver 1,000 times. So instead you dove, Squadron Leader Hartwell said. Yes, sir. Full dive. Maybe 3 seconds. Steep enough that my navigator's charts flew off his table. Then I pulled up hard. Not a gentle climb, but aggressive, using the speed from the dive. The G-forces pushed everyone down, but it also meant the fighter pilot experienced the same forces if he tried to track us. Then you rolled? Yes, sir. Port roll, maybe 40 degrees while still climbing. Then I leveled out briefly, dove again, pulled up into a starboard turn. The whole sequence took maybe 20 seconds. Flight Lieutenant Davies, veteran of 67 missions, spoke up. You're describing maneuvers that would disorient your crew, make accurate navigation impossible, and quite possibly exceed structural limits. Sir, I checked with my flight engineer afterward. We hit 97% of maximum stress but never exceeded it. And yes, my navigator was disoriented for about 30 seconds. But we were alive. One time. Against one fighter. Under specific conditions. Blackwood met his eyes. Sir, with respect, I've reviewed my crew's combat reports. The maneuvers gave my gunners firing opportunities they've never had during standard evasive procedures. My dorsal gunner got a 3-second firing solution when the fighter tried to track us through the climbing turn. My rear gunner had clear sight when we rolled. The chaos that disoriented us also disoriented the enemy. Hartwell stood, walked to the blackboard, began sketching flight paths. Describe the sequence again. Exact degrees of dive, duration, pull-up angle, roll characteristics. If this is replicable, it needs to be teachable. If it's not teachable, it's just luck. For the next 3 hours, Blackwood dissected his panic into components. Dive angles, timing sequences, throttle settings, control inputs. Slowly, what had felt like instinctive terror became technical specification. By the end of the session, Hartwell had a rough manual for what he tentatively called aggressive defensive maneuvering. Test flight tomorrow, Hartwell said. You'll demonstrate, I'll observe. And God help us all if this is as insane as it sounds. The test flight revealed something nobody had anticipated. Panic, when systematized, stopped being panic. Blackwood flew a Lancaster through the prescribed sequence of aggressive maneuvers while Hartwell occupied the co-pilot seat, monitoring instruments, feeling the aircraft's response, calculating whether what worked once through instinct could work consistently through training. Dive. 45 degrees, 3 seconds, full throttle. Pull up. Aggressive climb using momentum. G-forces pushing to 4.2. Roll. 40 degrees port while climbing, maintained for 2 seconds. Level. Brief stabilization. 1 second. Secondary dive. 30 degrees, 2 seconds. Climbing turn. Starboard. Aggressive angle. Using energy management. Return to level flight. Total sequence. 23 seconds. Structural stress. 94% of maximum limits. When they landed, Hartwell's face was pale but thoughtful. It works. Barely. The margin between effective defensive maneuver and uncontrolled flight leading to structural failure is about 2 degrees of angle and half a second of timing. Sir? It works, Blackwood, but it requires perfect execution under combat conditions while being shot at. That's a significant training challenge. Wing Commander Thornton joined them on the flight line. The alternative is continuing to fly predictable evasive patterns that German fighters have spent 3 years learning to counter. The alternative, Hartwell corrected, is training methods that have kept loss rates from being even higher than they already are. The philosophical debate was interrupted by reality. A Lancaster returning early from a daylight raid, smoke trailing from one engine, landing gear damaged. The crew stumbled out shaken but alive, and the pilot, Flight Lieutenant Morrison, 34 missions completed, found Hartwell immediately. Sir, we were engaged by 2 FW-190s over the channel. Standard evasive maneuvers weren't working. They were anticipating every turn. So I did something unorthodox. Describe it. Morrison's description matched Blackwood's sequence almost exactly. Aggressive dive, climbing turn, roll, secondary dive. Not identical, but close enough that Hartwell felt something shift in his understanding. Did it work? We're here, sir. One fighter broke off immediately. The other pressed the attack but couldn't maintain firing solution through the maneuvers. We took hits, but nothing catastrophic. Thornton looked at Hartwell. 2 pilots, 2 separate engagements, nearly identical instinctive responses, both effective. That's not coincidence. That's pattern. Hartwell nodded slowly, the weight of decision settling onto his shoulders. Controlled testing. 3 crews, experienced pilots only, full safety protocols. If it works under controlled conditions, we develop training curriculum. And if it doesn't work, then we stop before we kill people teaching them to replicate luck. September 1943. RAF Medmenham, Photographic Intelligence Division. The reconnaissance photographs arrived from multiple sources. Gun camera footage from returning bombers, aerial reconnaissance of Luftwaffe airfields, reports from intelligence operatives in occupied Europe. Pieced together, they told a story of enemy adaptation. German night fighter squadrons were circulating tactical bulletins. Lieutenant Commander Phillips spread the translated documents across the analysis table. They're calling the new maneuvers Wahnsinnsfliegen, insanity flying. Their pilots are reporting increased difficulty maintaining firing solutions against bombers exhibiting erratic and unpredictable flight characteristics. Thornton studied the documents, seeing confirmation in German concerns. They're adapting their tactics? Attempting to. But here's what's interesting. Phillips pulled out a Luftwaffe training memo. They're struggling to develop counter-tactics because the maneuvers aren't consistent. One bomber dives and climbs, another rolls and turns, a third does both in different sequences. They can't predict the response, which means they can't train effective counters, because we haven't standardized it yet. Exactly. Right now, only a handful of crews are using aggressive defensive maneuvers, each doing it slightly differently based on instinct. The Germans are seeing unpredictability as chaos rather than doctrine. Thornton felt the implications unfold. Once we standardize and train it widely, they'll identify the patterns and develop counters. Eventually, yes, but that's months away, possibly longer. Right now, we have a tactical advantage based on controlled unpredictability. The question is whether we formalize it into doctrine or keep it as improvised response. The strategic dilemma was clear. Formalization meant wider implementation and more lives saved, but also meant the enemy could study, analyze, and counter the tactics. Keeping it informal meant fewer crews benefited but maintained unpredictability. There's another factor, Phillips said, pulling out casualty statistics. Crews using aggressive maneuvers are reporting something unexpected: psychological impact on their own morale. They feel less helpless. Instead of flying straight while being shot at, they're actively fighting back through aircraft control. Morale doesn't show up in tactical analysis. No, but it shows up in survival rates. Crews who believe they can actively defend themselves fly differently. More alert, better communication, faster reactions. It's not just the maneuvers. It's the mindset shift from passive target to active combatant. Thornton absorbed this, understanding that tactical innovation couldn't be separated from human psychology. Recommendation: formalize the training but encourage variation within parameters. Teach the principles: aggressive altitude changes, unpredictable timing, but let pilots adapt to specific situations. Keep the chaos controlled, but don't eliminate it entirely. Controlled chaos as doctrine. That's a first. Sir, we're fighting an enemy that's had 3 years to learn our patterns. Maybe chaos is exactly what doctrine needs to be. October 1943. RAF Waddington, Squadron Commander's Office. Squadron Leader Hartwell reviewed the training casualty report with hands that wanted to shake but couldn't afford to. 1 Lancaster lost during training flight. 7 men dead. Cause: pilot exceeded structural limits attempting aggressive defensive maneuver. Aircraft broke apart at 18,000 feet. The pilot had been following the new doctrine, following what Hartwell had approved for training, following techniques that were supposed to save lives. Wing Commander Thornton entered without knocking, saw his face, understood immediately. Training accident: Pilot Officer Reynolds, 24 years old, 9 operational missions. He was executing the aggressive climbing turn and pushed the angle too far. Structural failure. No survivors. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't resurrect 7 men who died because we taught them to fly bombers like fighters. Hartwell stood, paced to the window. The margins are too tight, Sarah. The difference between effective defensive maneuver and fatal loss of control is angles measured in degrees, timing measured in fractions of seconds. We're asking exhausted pilots in damaged aircraft under combat stress to execute precision maneuvers with zero margin for error. We're asking them because the alternative is flying predictable patterns while German fighters shoot them down. Are we sure? Are we absolutely certain that aggressive maneuvering saves more lives than it costs? Thornton pulled out statistical analysis, pages of data compiled over 2 months of operational testing. Since introducing aggressive defensive training in August, loss rates for participating squadrons have dropped from 13% to 9.2%. Extrapolated across all operations, that's approximately 40 aircraft not lost, 280 lives saved. -7 from today's training accident. Yes, -7. She met his eyes. James, there is no safe option. Standard evasive procedures cost lives. Aggressive maneuvers cost lives. The question isn't which approach is risk-free. Neither is. The question is which approach costs fewer lives over time. And if Reynolds isn't an isolated incident? If we're trading predictable losses in combat for unpredictable losses in training? Then we refine the training. Add safety protocols. Better stress limit monitoring. Graduated progression before operational deployment. Hartwell looked at the casualty report, at Reynolds' name, at the notation, training accident, aggressive maneuver. I need to write to his parents, he said quietly. I need to explain why their son died practicing maneuvers that a rookie pilot invented during a panic attack. No, Thornton said firmly. You need to explain that their son died learning tactics that have saved 280 other sons. Both things are true. Both things matter. The silence stretched between them, filled with the impossible mathematics of command. November 18, 1943. Berlin, Germany. Large-scale implementation. The bomber stream consisted of 444 Lancasters, the largest force yet assembled for a single target, and among them were 89 crews trained in aggressive defensive maneuvering, enough to test whether tactics born from one rookie's panic could scale to strategic operations. Flight Lieutenant Blackwood, promoted after his accidental innovation, led a flight of 6 aircraft deep into German airspace. No longer a rookie, no longer panicking, but executing with deliberate precision the maneuvers that had once been pure instinct. Multiple contacts, his navigator reported. Night fighters moving into the stream. Estimate 12 to 15 aircraft. The first fighter made its approach on a neighboring bomber, and Blackwood watched through his canopy as the Lancaster, flown by a crew trained in aggressive maneuvers, suddenly dove, rolled, climbed in a sequence that shattered the fighter's firing solution. The Messerschmitt broke off, unwilling to commit to an engagement that had become unpredictable. Across the bomber stream, the pattern repeated. Fighters approaching with confidence learned from 3 years of combat, then encountering defensive responses they hadn't seen before. Some pressed attacks anyway and scored kills. Others broke off, calculating that the risk-reward had shifted unfavorably. "Fighter closing 5 o'clock low," Blackwood's rear gunner called. "Executing defensive sequence," Blackwood announced calmly, then threw the Lancaster into the practiced chaos. Dive, climb, roll, secondary dive, climbing turn. G-forces pushed the crew into their seats. The aircraft groaned but held, and the fighter, tracking what should have been a predictable target, found itself firing at empty sky. "He's breaking off. He's breaking off." The raid on Berlin cost Bomber Command 26 aircraft, a loss rate of 5.8%, the lowest for a Berlin raid in the entire war. In the debriefing room at dawn, Wing Commander Thornton compiled preliminary data while exhausted crews provided combat reports. The pattern was clear but not absolute. Crews using aggressive maneuvers had loss rates of 4.1%. Crews using standard doctrine had loss rates of 8.3%. Not a guarantee of survival, not a perfect solution, but measurably, statistically, demonstrably better. Squadron Leader Hartwell found Blackwood after the briefing. "You turned panic into doctrine. That's not supposed to be possible." Blackwood smiled tiredly. "Sir, I didn't turn panic into doctrine. I just showed that sometimes the thing that feels like losing control is actually the only way to take control back. That's going to be a hell of a thing to put in a training manual. Sir, with respect, every innovation in warfare started with someone doing something that wasn't in the manual." December 1943. RAF Duxford, Anglo-American Tactical Exchange. The American officers arrived with questions about reports they'd been receiving. RAF bombers executing maneuvers that B-17 and B-24 pilots considered impossible for heavy aircraft. Maneuvers that seemed to contradict everything known about bomber handling characteristics. Colonel Robert Hendricks, 8th Air Force Tactical Development Officer, watched gun camera footage of Lancaster bombers performing aggressive defensive sequences and shook his head. "Our doctrine is built on formation integrity and concentrated defensive fire. You're showing me individual aircraft maneuvering like fighters." Wing Commander Thornton pulled up statistical data. "Colonel, your daylight raids are experiencing loss rates of 12 to 18% on deep penetration missions. Our night raids using aggressive defensive maneuvers are running between 5 and 7%. The primary difference is unpredictability. The primary difference is that you're flying at night with less fighter opposition. We're flying at night with different fighter opposition. Radar-equipped night fighters with upward-firing cannons and years of experience hunting bombers. They're just as deadly as your day fighters. They've just adapted to different conditions." Hendricks studied the footage again, watching a Lancaster execute a dive-climb-roll sequence that made his pilot instincts recoil. Those maneuvers would break formation integrity. Our entire defensive doctrine depends on maintaining position in the combat box, and German fighters have spent 2 years learning exactly how to attack combat boxes. They know your formation spacing, your defensive gun arcs, your evasive procedures. You're predictable, which means you're vulnerable. The accusation hung in the air until Colonel Hendricks nodded slowly. "You're not wrong. We've lost 374 aircraft in 3 months. The boys are calling deep penetration missions maximum effort because everyone knows the odds." He paused. "Can B-17s even perform these maneuvers? That's the question. Your aircraft have different handling characteristics, different structural limits, different crew positions. The principles might translate: aggressive altitude changes, unpredictable timing, controlled chaos, but the specific techniques would need adaptation." Hendricks made a decision visible in the shift of his shoulders. "We need to test it. Modified doctrine for American bombers based on your principles. Joint training program, shared data, combined tactical development." "Agreed. The Germans are already adapting to our maneuvers. If both RAF and USAAF forces implement variations of aggressive defense, the enemy has to counter multiple tactical approaches simultaneously. Makes them reactive instead of proactive." "Exactly. And in aerial combat, the side that's reacting is the side that's losing." The partnership formalized what both sides already understood. Survival meant sharing every advantage, regardless of national pride or institutional tradition. The mathematics of death, Didn't respect flags. February 1944. RAF High Wycombe, Strategic Planning Conference. The map room displayed the accumulated weight of 18 months of strategic bombing, hundreds of raids, thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of sorties. Red pins marked targets destroyed. Blue pins marked aircraft lost. The ratio between red and blue represented the brutal calculus of attrition warfare. Air Marshal Harris addressed assembled commanders with the exhausted precision of a man who measured victory and acceptable loss rates rather than decisive triumph. Aggressive defensive maneuvering, introduced operationally in August 1943, has contributed to an overall reduction in bomber loss rates from 14% to 7.3% across all operations. This represents approximately 520 aircraft not lost, 3,640 aircrew not killed. He let the numbers settle. However, we are observing enemy adaptation. German fighter squadrons are developing counter-tactics, standoff attacks with rockets, coordinated multi-fighter approaches, revised interception angles designed to exploit moments of vulnerability during aggressive maneuvers. Wing Commander Thornton stood, presenting intelligence analysis. The Luftwaffe is specifically training pilots to anticipate aggressive defensive maneuvers. They're calculating optimal attack timing during the transition between dive and climb. When bombers are briefly predictable, our tactical advantage is degrading. Then what's the recommendation? Harris asked. Continued evolution. We can't allow aggressive maneuvering to become standardized to the point of predictability. We need variation within parameters, different sequences, different timing, individual pilot adaptation, while maintaining safety margins. Squadron Leader Hartwell spoke up. Sir, we're already training pilots to operate at the edge of controllability. Adding requirement for improvisation increases complexity and risk. Maintaining predictability guarantees casualties, Thornton countered. The enemy adapts faster than we can revise doctrine. The only sustainable advantage is tactical flexibility. The debate continued. Safety versus effectiveness, standardization versus improvisation, institutional control versus individual initiative. Every military organization's eternal tension, made urgent by bombs and bullets. Flight Lieutenant Blackwood, now a technical advisor despite his junior rank, raised a hand. Sir, may I suggest something from the perspective of someone who accidentally started this? Harris nodded. The maneuvers work not because they're brilliant, but because they're unexpected. The moment they become expected, they stop working. Maybe that's the doctrine. Teach the principles, demonstrate the techniques, then trust pilots to adapt in real time. Make unpredictability itself the standard. That's chaos. Sir, with respect, we're already fighting in chaos. Maybe the doctrine should reflect reality instead of pretending we can eliminate it. The room was silent. Controlled chaos as operational doctrine, Harris said slowly. That's either brilliant or catastrophic. Possibly both. March 24, 1944. Nuremberg, Germany. Maximum effort operation. The Nuremberg raid would be remembered as one of the costliest operations of the bombing campaign. 795 aircraft dispatched, 96 lost, 12.1% casualties. But within that catastrophe, a smaller story unfolded. Flight Lieutenant Blackwood led a formation of 18 Lancasters, all crews trained in aggressive defensive maneuvering, all aware they were flying into the most heavily defended target in Germany. The night fighters came in waves. Not opportunistic attacks, but coordinated assault. Multiple fighters engaging single bombers, anticipating evasive maneuvers, exploiting the predictable moments during standard defensive sequences. German pilots who had spent months studying the new RAF tactics, learning the patterns, developing counters. Multiple contacts, Blackwood's navigator shouted. 3 fighters closing from different vectors. This was the nightmare scenario. Coordinated attack designed to overwhelm individual defensive capability. Standard doctrine said, maintain formation, rely on mutual support. Aggressive maneuvering said break formation, become unpredictable. Blackwood made the decision in a fraction of a second. All aircraft execute individual defensive maneuvers. Break formation on my mark. Mark. 18 Lancasters scattered into controlled chaos. Each pilot executing aggressive sequences, but no two identical. One dove and rolled port. Another climbed and rolled starboard. A third combined both in unpredictable timing. The night sky became a three-dimensional puzzle of bombers moving in ways that contradicted everything German pilots had been trained to expect from heavy aircraft. The fighters pressed attacks anyway. Some found firing solutions. 3 Lancasters went down, bright flashes against darkness. 21 men gone. But 15 survived. Blackwood's aircraft was engaged by 2 fighters simultaneously, a coordinated pincer that should have been lethal. He dove steep, pulled into climbing turn, rolled inverted briefly, a maneuver not in any manual, then snap-rolled upright and dove again. His gunners fired during brief moments of opportunity. The fighters broke off, unwilling to commit to an engagement that had become impossible to predict. By dawn, of Blackwood's original 18 aircraft, 15 returned. Across the entire bomber stream, 795 aircraft. Those equipped and trained in aggressive maneuvers lost 8.7%. Those flying standard doctrine lost 13.9%. The difference? Approximately 17 aircraft, 119 lives. In the debriefing room, exhausted crews described engagements where maneuvers born from a rookie's panic had evolved into sophisticated tactical doctrine, where controlled chaos had become the difference between survival and statistics. Blackwood filed his combat report with hands that no longer shook, no longer panicked, simply performed the practiced movements of a pilot who had accidentally changed how bombers fought. Mission accomplished meant coming home. Everything else was detail. May 1944. RAF Medmenham, Final Assessment Review. The conference room contained senior commanders, intelligence analysts, tactical development officers, and 1 former rookie pilot who had turned panic into doctrine. On the walls, charts tracked 18 months of evolution, loss rates declining, enemy adaptation accelerating, tactical innovation spreading across Allied bomber forces. Air Marshal Harris stood before the assembled group and delivered the assessment with characteristic directness. Aggressive defensive maneuvering has saved approximately 3,640 lives since operational introduction in August 1943. It has not won the air war. It has not eliminated bomber losses. What it has done is buy time and reduce casualties while we develop other tactical advantages. Long-range fighter escorts, improved electronic countermeasures, better target intelligence. He gestured to Blackwood. Flight Lieutenant Blackwood's contribution was not revolutionary technology or brilliant strategy. His contribution was demonstrating that institutional doctrine, no matter how carefully developed, can become vulnerability when the enemy learns to exploit it. Wing Commander Thornton added context. German intelligence reports decoded through Ultra show the Luftwaffe has devoted significant resources to understanding and countering aggressive defensive maneuvers. They've revised training programs, developed new attack tactics, modified aircraft armament. All of that represents resources and time they're not spending on offensive innovation. So we've forced them into reactive posture, Squadron Leader Hartwell observed. Temporarily. They're already developing counters to our counters. This is the nature of tactical evolution. Perpetual adaptation, advantage and counter-advantage, innovation racing against enemy learning. A junior officer raised a hand. Sir, if the advantage is temporary, was it worth the training costs and casualties? Harris looked at him with the tired eyes of a commander who had calculated these equations too many times. Is 3,640 lives saved worth 7 training fatalities and months of revised doctrine? That's not a tactical question. That's a moral one. And I don't have an answer that makes peace with both numbers. Blackwood spoke quietly. Sir, permission to offer perspective? Granted. The maneuvers I executed during my 7th mission weren't brilliant. They were panic. What transformed panic into doctrine wasn't my skill. It was institutional willingness to question certainty. To consider that maybe a rookie's terrified reaction contained insight that years of experience had overlooked. He paused, gathering words. The real innovation wasn't the maneuvers. It was creating an organization flexible enough to learn from accidents, humble enough to admit doctrine might be wrong, and courageous enough to change procedures that cost lives, even when change also costs lives. Sir, doing nothing costs lives with absolute certainty. Innovation costs lives with partial probability. Those aren't equivalent odds. The room absorbed this truth in silence. June, 1944. Imperial War Museum. Tactical Innovation Archives. The museum curator had asked Blackwood to contribute artifacts documenting the development of aggressive defensive maneuvering, training manuals, combat reports, gun camera footage, statistical analyses. evidence that panic, when properly understood, could become doctrine. Blackwood provided everything except what the curator wanted most: a heroic narrative. The official history, the curator explained, will emphasize innovation, tactical genius, lives saved through brilliant adaptation. That's what future generations need to understand. The truth, Blackwood countered, is that I panicked. I violated every principle of formation discipline because I was terrified and inexperienced and didn't know what else to do. The fact that my panic happened to match the flight characteristics necessary to break a targeting solution was accident, not genius. But you systematized the accident, turned instinct into teachable technique. No, Wing Commander Thornton systematized it. Squadron Leader Hartwell made it teachable. Dozens of test pilots refined it. Hundreds of crews validated it. I just got lucky and survived long enough for smarter people to understand what I'd done accidentally. The curator was quiet for a moment. That's not how military history works. History needs heroes, clear narratives, decisive moments. History needs truth. The truth is that innovations rarely come from brilliant individuals having eureka moments. They come from accidents being noticed, patterns being recognized, institutions being flexible enough to learn from unexpected sources. He pulled out a combat report, his 7th mission, the night everything changed. This document shows what actually happened: a rookie pilot losing control, making mistakes, surviving through luck and instinct. If this becomes heroic innovation in the official record, we miss the real lesson, which is that the most valuable capability any organization can develop isn't better weapons or superior training or brilliant leadership. It's the ability to learn from accidents, recognize patterns in chaos, and change procedures even when change is uncomfortable. The curator studied the combat report, seeing data rather than legend. You're asking me to preserve complexity instead of simplifying into narrative. I'm asking you to preserve the lesson that might save lives in future wars. That certainty kills, flexibility survives, and sometimes the best innovations come from people who don't know enough to understand why what they're doing shouldn't work. That's a difficult message for an institution built on discipline and doctrine. Sir, Blackwood said with tired certainty, difficult messages are usually the important ones. November 1945. Oxford University, Military History Seminar. Henry Blackwood, now a civilian with a distinguished flying cross and a permanent place in tactical aviation history, gave his first academic lecture to students who had been children when the war began. He started with the question that mattered: how many of you believe military innovation comes from brilliant strategists making calculated decisions? Most hands went up. You're wrong. Most military innovation comes from accidents, mistakes, and desperate improvisation by people who don't know they're not supposed to do what they're doing. He showed them the gun camera footage from his 7th mission. Chaotic, undisciplined maneuvering that violated every principle of formation flying. This is panic, uncontrolled reaction by an inexperienced pilot who didn't know what else to do. It saved my life not because it was smart, but because it was unexpected. The lecture hall was silent. The real story isn't that I discovered brilliant tactics. The real story is that the RAF was flexible enough to recognize that a rookie's panic might contain tactical insight. That Wing Commander Thornton saw pattern instead of failure. That Squadron Leader Hartwell was willing to test ideas that contradicted his experience. That hundreds of pilots were courageous enough to learn techniques that pushed aircraft to structural limits. He paused, looking at faces too young to remember, but old enough to learn. Aggressive defensive maneuvering saved approximately 3,640 lives during 18 months of operations. That number matters. But what matters more is understanding why it worked. Not because the maneuvers were perfect, but because they were unpredictable. The moment they became standardized, the enemy adapted. The advantage was always temporary. In your careers, whether military, civilian, technical, or creative, you will encounter situations where established doctrine fails. You'll face choices between following proven procedures and attempting something unprecedented. Remember that doctrine exists for good reasons, built from accumulated experience and purchased with sacrifice. But also remember that every doctrine has assumptions, and assumptions become vulnerabilities when circumstances change. The lesson isn't ignore doctrine. The lesson is question certainty. Be humble enough to learn from accidents. Be flexible enough to recognize patterns in chaos. Be courageous enough to change when change might save lives. I panicked my way into tactical innovation. That shouldn't have worked. The fact that it did tells you something important about the nature of innovation. It rarely looks brilliant when it's happening. It usually looks like mistakes that accidentally worked. If this story made you reconsider the relationship between panic and innovation, between accident and insight, share it, because the future belongs to those who can learn from chaos, rather than just endure it. The rookie who turned panic into doctrine taught us something essential. Sometimes survival requires doing what you're not supposed to do, and sometimes institutions grow stronger by learning from their least experienced members. War is won not just through strength and discipline, but through the courage to learn from accidents and the humility to change what isn't working.